Well, the boss called me up and said, come in to work. I just hung up on that slave-driving jerk. I'm going to wrestling. Going to wrestling. Well, you'd think I'd rather be sweating on a dock or watching somebody use a hammerlock. I'm going to wrestling. Going to wrestling. R-A-S-S-L-I-N, that's wrestling. R-A-S-S-L-I-N, that's wrestling.
Talking about today. Vance, thanks for coming on the show with us today.
Absolutely. My pleasure, gentlemen.
So Vance, I mean, I say prolific and some people might be like, yeah, like he wrote a book, but you've written, this is your second book now, isn't it?
This is the third book, yeah.
Third book, wow.
Yeah. The second book was Wrestling in the Canadian West.
Okay, that's the one I know about. Then what was the first book?
Yeah. The first book, was sort of a self-published effort in 1999 that I don't talk about that much because when I look back at the book that was written then, I'm almost embarrassed. But it was, put out as a 23-year-old kid that just wanted to write about wrestling history.
Yeah, you're definitely an accomplished historian who's got quite a resume for yourself. What was it that got you interested in the history, especially of Canadian wrestling, but wrestling as a whole? It
was kind of by fluke, which is a recurring theme in life. But I had just started wrestling in Winnipeg, and I was about a year in. And we got television on Shaw Cable for River City Wrestling, and I didn't even watch the program because I was living in Brandon at the time, and the program didn't reach the surrounding towns. So I had come in, a day early one time to go to a buddy's house and actually watch the show and see like how it actually played out. And in the commentary of one of my matches, Doug McCall mentioned, Vance, Nevada is a student of Ernest Frenchie Rowe, who was tag team partners with Frenchie Champagne, and they were very successful back in the day. And I thought that's incredibly bizarre because in the time that I had trained with Ernie Rowe, he had never mentioned Frenchie Champagne at all. And I just thought, well, geez, he must not have been that big of a deal. But it got me curious, and so I started to go down to the Winnipeg Public Archives in the summer of '94. Looking for this connection between the guy that trained me and my trainer, Ernest Rowe. And what I discovered that summer was that citation was completely fictitious. There was no connection between Frenchie Champagne and Ernie Rowe. But what I found out was that the Winnipeg wrestling scene in the 50s and 60s was incredible. And Frenchie Champagne was a huge deal. So he was the headliner of the local shows that ran out of St. Boniface. But then he was also like the referee when the wrestling would come out of Minneapolis. And so all the big stars like Gene Kiniski and Buddy Rogers, well, Frenchie Champagne was in the mix as a referee on those shows.
Okay.
So he was kind of like Mr. Wrestling for Winnipeg in that time. But, then when I discovered that you had, Bulldog Bob Brown, Moose Morawski, Gil Hayes, the Von Steigers, Roy McClarty, George Gordienko, Gordon Nelson, Bill Dromo, all these guys that came out of Winnipeg that went on to be international stars. It was like I was hooked. I needed to find more, and that just kind of started was supposed to be a summer project in 1994. Continues to this day.
So Doug McCall is the guy that inspired you to become a historian, and he was BSing?
Yeah.
That's an amazing story. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've done as much homework as anybody probably on the planet about Canadian wrestling and especially wrestling's history in Winnipeg. Was Bulldog Bob Brown the biggest star to go from Winnipeg and become an international star at that time before Piper, or was there others that I'm missing?
I think, Moose Morawski and Bob Brown, they're kind of these, territory, mainstays, journeymen, you might say. But I think the long overlooked story from Winnipeg is George Gordienko.
Okay.
So Gordienko, from the time he was, in middle school, was on the sports pages in Winnipeg for anything that he would do. If he decided he was going to play rugby, well, then he was on the championship rugby team. If he was going to do weightlifting, he was breaking, provincial and national records. So when he got into professional wrestling after, training as an amateur at the Winnipeg YMCA, He went to Minneapolis, which was what everybody did at that time. You want to go pro, you have to go to Minneapolis and train with Joe Pazendak. And so Gordienko got down there, and in his first year in the business, they were already saying, this guy is going to be a future world champion. Like at 19 years old, they were already sort of tagging this guy with that. Now, unfortunately for George, having the last name Gordienko at the height of the McCarthy era in the United States, where they were, hunting communists, in 1949, he got expelled from the United States.
Whoa!
For suspicion of being a communist.
Oh.
So he came home to Winnipeg and, rightfully so, said, you know what, screw America. I'll never wrestle on American soil again.
Mm-hmm.
And actually took a few years off from wrestling altogether and did a little bit of traveling internationally. And then a few years later, Stu Hart called him up and said, hey, why don't you come wrestle for me? And, he got back into the game in the early 50s and wrestled a few years for Stu Hart. But then he got connected with these European guys that Stu was bringing in. And they said, George, you really should come to England. And when he got over to Europe, he became, such a major sensation in Europe that he became, I'd say in a similar way, if you've heard about the culture of Japanese wrestling, if you want to be a big star in Japan, you learn your trade there, then you have to go abroad for a year, completely for a year, and then come back, and then they'll actually move you to the main events.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that time, a lot of guys were doing that in Europe. You want to be a big star in New Zealand or wherever, you have to go to England. That was the place. And so you'd have guys like John De Silva from New Zealand or Adnan El Casey from Iraq. They'd go over to England, wrestle for a year, sort of get their experience and their credibility, and then they'd come back. And when they would come back and then establish themselves as the headliner in their country, George Gordienko would be the guy brought in to make them. So he did it in India, he did it in New Zealand, he did it in Greece, and he did it in Iraq. And the match in Iraq, this one is one that, is just such a fascinating story. So when Gordienko went to Iraq in 1971 to put over Adnan El Casey, he was paid $10,000.
Wow. In 1971 money.
In 1971.
Yeah.
When he went there, he was put up in the palace for a week, and there was lots of media interviews and public workouts and things like that. When they actually got to the stadium for the match, they drew 110,000 people.
Oh,
wow!
They were the only match on the show.
And how long did they go?
Not long, because as George Gordienko started to get the heat on El Casey, he could see the tensions rising in the crowd to the point where it was getting dangerous. And he said, "Okay, let's take it home." And it was like a police escort directly from the ring into a van and out of the stadium.
Wow!
Take it home, kid.
Yeah. So they called George at the hotel later and said, "Okay, so in 4 days when we do this again in Riyadh, here's how it's going to go." George said, "It's not happening again. I'm going home."
Yeah. Was George ever able to get back to the States? Because in 71, tensions on communism had really eased, you would think, right? Did he ever go back to the States?
Well, the interesting thing about George is that had history gone different for him, he would be a household name right now. Yeah. So during that time when he was working with Stu, one of the guys that he had a chance to wrestle was Lou Thez. And of course, Lou is legendary NWA world champion.
Mm-hmm.
And after doing a couple of 1 hour draws with Lou Thez was actually petitioning to drop the belt to George Gordienko.
Wow.
And so they had files going forward to the U.S. State Department to, have his ban lifted. And when that didn't happen, the belt did come back to Canada, but it went back to Whipper Billy Watson for his second reign. But Watson's second reign was supposed to be Gordienko's run.
Oh, all this from Winnipeg. Did he homestead in Winnipeg?
No, after he started wrestling, he hardly ever came back to Winnipeg. His parents were still living in the North End, so he would come in and visit his folks and maybe pick up a match while he was in town. In the 70s, he had a couple of spots for the AWA.
Yeah.
But, one of the really fascinating things about Gordienko isn't even a wrestling fact. It's, when he got over to Europe, and he as a kid, he was like always like dabbling in art and things like that. But when we got over to Europe, like he just discovered this like rich culture of art, and even, had the opportunity to study directly under Pablo Picasso.
Wow.
So when he wasn't on the road wrestling, he was in an art school and taking art lessons and learning how to paint. And so when he finished wrestling, entirely in 1975, he had this long-term love affair with a contessa in Italy. And so he was living in a castle in the hills of Italy, painting every day and riding horses, until it just sort of, he reached a point in life when it was time to come home. And then he settled on Vancouver Island and lived out the rest of his days.
And when did he pass away?
2002.
How old would he have been when he passed away?
Off the top of my head, I want to say 74.
Wow.
Talk about a North End Winnipeg boy making good.
Yeah.
Living in a castle in Italy.
Yeah. That's incredible. So that's the type of stories you tell in your book, in this upcoming book, Uncontrolled Chaos?
Yeah. It's trying to find a way to really thread that into the narrative. So, first of all, there's so little information out there. Like for example, if you talk about the Stampede Wrestling territory, people will talk about the Hart family, but they're not talking about the workhorses that kept the territory alive when the Hart boys were out wrestling in Japan and Germany and Atlanta, trying to make their names internationally, like the Cuban Assassin and Gamma Singh and Dave Rule. These were the guys that were really like, logging the hours. And one of the sections of the book actually lists like the top 100 most prolific wrestlers. So who wrestled the most matches, who had the most wins in Canadian history. And people are going to be surprised when they see that, Bret Hart, that name that we automatically assume with Canadian wrestling, isn't even in the top 20.
No, that actually wouldn't surprise me as much as you think, because he might be the most successful Canadian wrestler. But after 84, he was still a young man when he went to work for Vince.
Yeah. So there's a lot of guys, that have made that list where you're like, okay, I'm kind of familiar with the name. I just had no idea they were such a big deal.
Yeah.
And put in so much time, to wrestling in Canada.
So is the win-loss record specific to matches in Canada or matches in their career?
Specific to matches in Canada.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. There was a lot of, when you think about, the results research, and I've been doing that since 1994. Now the collection is more than 6,000 pages.
Wow.
And more than 60,000 shows from 1876 to now.
I think I main evented 1876.
Yeah. I'll check the record.
So 60,000 shows since 1874 that you've been able to find the results for.
Yeah, it's sometimes only the lineup.
Yeah,
but and it's kind of an ironic thing. Like right now in the digital age, it's actually harder to find results if you're not right on top of it and sort of following, the social channels of the promoters, because nobody's advertising in the newspaper anymore.
No,
and nobody has that relationship with the sports editors anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually easier to find results from the 30s than it is to find them from the 2010s.
I would imagine it'd be tough to be able to vet your sources too with online stuff, because, the internet's got lots of misinformation out there. And if you go to a library and you find it in a book, that's pretty much the vetting process there. Yeah,
there's a, and then I think the other unique challenge of wrestling that you don't have in other sports is, as an example, right now, I'm already working on a next project and putting together a list of Canadian-born professional wrestlers. And, in the first 1,500 names on the list, when I cross-reference that with all of the gimmicks that they used, you might have 1,500 names that combined wrestled under 3,000 different names.
Wow.
So trying to attribute, the stats to, and some of that is, okay, there's a one-off because somebody no-showed, so they needed someone to double up. And if they didn't simply just say, okay, well, tonight, Chris, you're going to wrestle twice. Oh, no, we can't have that happen. So, in match 3, you're going to be under this mask and we're going to call you this. So trying to put all those pieces of the puzzle together is one of the challenges you definitely don't have when you're researching the career of like Wayne Gretzky.
Definitely.
Like, well, what about that? What about that year that he, played under the name, the Masked Gunman?
That's amazing. So your first book, or second book, I guess it was, came out in 2009, and it was called Wrestling in the Canadian West. This is a sequel to it?
Yeah, you know what? After I did that one, when you get into like the nuances of wrestling, I just thought like the project was such a monster. I don't know if I'll ever tackle it again. Mm-hmm. And then you also had the people that said, okay, well, now you've done the book on Canadian West. When's your book on the Canadian East?
Yeah, no kidding.
And so I thought, okay, well, when the pandemic happened and life shut down, there was nowhere to go and nowhere to be except at home in front of a computer screen. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll tackle that Eastern Canada project. And then, as the pandemic continued, I thought, well, you know what, like by the time I get the East one out, it'll be time to update the West. So why don't I just look at doing a national representation of wrestling history that really focuses on 1930 to the present, because that's really when the territories really started to get established. And they cover it as thoroughly as I possibly can.
How many pages is it going to be?
462 pages.
That's incredible. Just think of how much work goes into researching enough material to come up with 462 pages. Impressive. What is the thing that you found most surprising? You brought up Gordienko, but like, even in the modern era of history, say from 75 on, what were the things that were most surprising in your research?
I think, if you talk to people in every region of the country, they all have this very strong emotional attachment to their sort of home promotion. And so everyone will say, well, you know what, Stampede Wrestling was the best, or no, Vancouver All-Star Wrestling was the best. But when you look at the sheer volume of activity that was happening, the West was actually pretty easy to research comparatively to the East, because you had in the case of Stampede Wrestling, for example, Stu was wrestling, presenting shows 6 nights a week. So once you got the rhythm down and said, okay, we've got Friday in Calgary, Saturday in Edmonton, Sunday is typically off. Monday is Lethbridge, Tuesday is Red Deer, Wednesday Saskatoon, and Thursday is Regina. You've got your sort of roadmap set up. Okay, these are the newspapers I need to check out, and these are the days of the week I need to be looking specifically. And when you try to apply that the same way in Ontario, it just doesn't work, because and if you've ever looked at the old match results that sometimes you'd see in the back of Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine, and you'd see these shows from Maple Leaf Gardens in the 70s where they had like 10 matches on the show, and you're like, how could they possibly sustain a roster with that many people on the payroll? Well, what was happening in Ontario, it wasn't a 6-show-a-week schedule. They had Toronto and Maple Leaf Gardens on Thursday nights, but then every other night of the week, every single night of the week, they were running 3 shows.
Wow.
So that 10-match card got split up into 3 3-match cards, and they were wrestling 3 shows a night all throughout the rest of the week. And it was the same in Quebec. So you had the Rougeaus running Montreal and Quebec City and Ottawa as their major cities, but there was always a smaller show that was happening as well. So they were running at least 2 shows a night, even including the night that Montreal was on. So they had like a 14-show schedule per week. And then in 1971, when the Bichons came in to run opposition to the Rougeaus, they came in running equally big cards with the same schedule. So now you've got, this 28 shows a week happening in Quebec for a period of about 4 or 5 years. So just like the sheer volume of work that was happening and the star power that was going on in Montreal at that period of time, it's just completely overwhelming.
So, and that was started in the 70s. When did Montreal and like the Quebec territory start to dry up a little bit? Was that in the late 80s or mid 80s?
Well, there was a gap. So from 71 to, I want to say 74, it was red hot.
Yeah.
So you had the Rougeaus drawing upon Detroit and using the Sheik's crew out of Detroit. And then you had Vachon, of course, drawing upon his relationships with Minneapolis and Vern Gagne in the AWA. And, you know, it was just this perpetual cycle of them trying to outdo each other. And, you know, they reached like unparalleled heights, you know, so in 72, the Rougeaus drew 26,000,
wow,
you know, at Delorimier Park in Montreal. So the following year, you know, the Vachon had to outdo it and they drew 29.
Wow.
But then you reach a point where, okay, we've shotgunned everything that we can do to outdo the other guy. Houses started to drop, you know, conflict started to happen when those houses started to drop. And then in 74, they actually tried to do joint super shows. Mm-hmm. You know, so they put some of these dream matches together. But the problem was, as happens when you get two promoters that don't trust each other working together, rather than give the people, you know, a main event finish that they could get excited about, you know, they ended up being like, you know, oh, we're going to have this go to like a double count out.
Negotiated finishes.
And after they did that once, the second time they tried it, the draw was nowhere near it was on the first. And by the end of the year, both companies were pretty well, you know, done.
Wow.
So from 75 to 80, the territory was dead.
Yeah.
Until Gino Brito came in and got funding and support from Andre the Giant and Frank Valois. They all came in and reopened with international wrestling in Montreal. It took them about 2 or 3 years to build it back up to a level where they could get shows back into the Montreal Forum.
Yeah. So that dead period for Quebec, was it a result of them hot-shotting everything they had, just blowing their wad and then having nothing left?
I think it was the combination of that, but then also because the territory was so hot, then you have the American promoters get very, very interested and say, well, holy shit, like if these guys are drawing these kind of crowds in Montreal, like we should get these guys on our circuit. So then you had guys like Dino Bravo, you know, getting signed to go to the North Carolina, you know, first with the Eddie Einhorn IWA and then getting in with, you know, Mid-Atlantic. You had guys, you know, getting noticed and going to the AWA or to the WWF. So, you know, there's sort of this migration of guys that, well, geez, these guys are really big deals in Montreal. We should bring them in because obviously they draw. And so you had that combination of things happening where talent was moving up, you know, some of the old talent was moving out, and the crowds were just burned out.
Vance, I wanted to ask you something before we move on with this. The nuts and the bolts of the writing process, because that's something that a lot of times has to be developed, but did you have a love for writing early on? Yeah,
you know what, when I was, you know, in high school, you know, I think I had mentioned to like a guidance counselor one time, they said, what do you want to do when you get out of school? I said, I want to be a pro wrestler. And he laughed in my face and said, okay, but you know, we can't put that in the yearbook. So what are you going to tell people you want to do for a living? Like really a real job. And I thought, well, geez, I'd like to be a newspaper reporter. And then I found out that newspaper reporters don't make any money. It's like there's no money in that job at all.
Still true.
So, yeah, you know, but I always had a passion for writing, and so even as a teenager, I was finding ways to get odd jobs at the local newspaper, and you know cover some of those feel good events, like, oh, the circus came to town, I'll go down there and write a story about that. So, you know, writing has always been, you know, an interest and a passion, but I certainly don't have the patience or creativity to write fiction. Yeah. And nonfiction, you know, particularly in professional wrestling, the stories are way more fascinating than anything you could ever make up.
Absolutely. As seen with Heels, it wasn't as good as the real thing, but that's just my opinion. So let's pivot for a second. You broke into the wrestling game as a 17-year-old, correct? With River City Wrestling?
Yeah.
17 when you had your professional debut. What are some career highlights? I could guess them, but I'd like to hear you mention what some of your career highlights were in the ring.
I think some of the highlights that come, it's those things that you didn't plan for or expect. So when you get into the business, sometimes I think many people do. They get in and they've got this vision that, okay, well, it's going to be a WrestleMania main event for me at some point in my future. Not realizing that this is very misguided, and you're very often being counseled and coached by people who don't even have a hope of getting that themselves. And if they can't, how can they help you get there?
Mm-hmm.
I think the first highlight for me was the opportunity to be able to tour nationally, because once you've got out of that home territory, and I mean, you guys have been in the Winnipeg scene, you know how it's very self-deprecating and very much I'm the big fish in the small pond kind of mindset. And I won't mention names because we know who those guys are. But once you got out and had this context that, okay, wait a minute, I'm not a big deal. Every time that I wrestle in a new territory or a new town, I have to reprove myself, whether it's an expectation of the promoter or just something yourself, that, okay, this crowd doesn't know me. I need to reintroduce myself every night, and I can't just go back to the same spots that I'm doing at Chalmers every week, because these people don't know them and they're not going to pop for that.
Yep.
So just that, I think that self-awareness, even the first opportunity to get out on the road and experience that, when you would come home to Winnipeg, you just had this like huge aha moment. The next time you walked into a Winnipeg locker room, where you're like, holy shit, I can't believe I've been listening to this asshole for 3 years, because he's been steering me completely wrong.
I don't know that was necessarily intentionally wrong either. My experience as a booker would lay parallel to what you just said. I always found that the guys that had to drive in for more than 5 hours and had to stay in a hotel and had to sacrifice an entire day to come in, always carried themselves differently, like they were more vested in the opportunity than the guy that came from 20 minutes away from his house. However, I would also say that when that same guy that came 20 minutes from his house and kind of had that Winnipegitis, when he went on the road and went to Edmonton, he was different when he went to Edmonton. He didn't pull the same shit in Winnipeg locker room, or he didn't pull the same shit in the Edmonton locker room that he might do in his home locker room. I think it's just a creature of comfort. Maybe because you've seen more territories, you could say differently, but I think it has to do with the commitment it takes to get to an event that far away, maybe, no?
Yeah, well, I think that's somewhat fair. But I think that, it's always, and I know Mike could speak to this, having worked as a promoter and a booker with, top talent in the industry. One of the weirdest dynamics is often when you're working with people that have had success, they are so chill and so easy to do business with, versus the guy that's never been anywhere and thinks that he's a big deal.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. Like in the WFX locker room, the guys that were making the most money and who had earned the most money in their careers were much more amenable to do stuff than some of the guys that had made the least. It was kind of eye-opening in some cases. But yeah, and on top of that, the dynamic was interesting where the most helpful guys were the guys. Bob Hawley drove in from Iowa every 3 weeks, and everyone had said he's a bully and he's going to be a challenge in the locker room. He was the most chill guy. He was the best leader we had. He wanted to help the young guys. But the young guys in Winnipeg had an opinion of some, like what you say is 100% right, that there is a problem underlying the Winnipeg scene. I've never understood what caused it. I've never understood what has allowed it to permeate for so long. Do you have a theory to that?
Mm-hmm. I just think that it happened because there was a period of time where Winnipeg largely, I mean, and our mutual friend Darren Metzelar would say Winnipeg was geographically castrated. And, at the time, I never really thought about it. But, in Toronto, you had guys that, were either working in Michigan or New York. The Maritimes guys are working in, New England, Calgary, a similar situation to Manitoba, but because of the positioning of Stampede Wrestling, a lot of guys were better networked.
Yeah. And it also helped that
the Hart family name.
Yeah, and it also helped the territory had 5 major markets they could run within 5 hours, right? So they could get talent to come there and stay there for a longer period.
Yeah, so you had that period of time from when the AWA closed in '86, where now we were really cut off. Like there was no other talent coming in just casually on the weekend. Like here in Vancouver, they were so close to Seattle that you had these American guys that were coming up and is just excited to be here. And when you have Winnipeg, it's okay. Well, there's nobody coming in, so the stars are who's here. And they were allowed to dictate and run roughshod. And when you had this generation of guys with that mindset that now have passed that on to the next guys coming in, it's kind of like that, that fable of, the monkeys in the cage. And if you try to climb the ladder and grab that banana, you get shot with the water gun. Well, after only a little bit of time, the monkeys will stop you from trying to grab that banana anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what happened, where guys were so paranoid about their own position in that local market that they never wanted to see anyone else succeed above them, and would do everything they could to discourage them, whether overtly or covertly.
Interesting. Fascinating, actually. We could talk about this all day, but I want to talk about Vance Nevada's wrestling career. How does the ladder match with Robbie Royce rank up there in, say, top 10 matches?
Of my career?
Yeah.
It wouldn't be on the list.
Wow. So what's number 1 or number 5? What are some of the highlights?
I think, sometimes the matches where the light bulb comes on are tremendously impactful. And one of those for me was the first time that I had the opportunity to wrestle with Adam Pearce. Mm-hmm. Because often, coming out of Winnipeg, you reached a point where, okay, well, if I want to get booked with any promoter, I know that I can just call them and I'll be on the show. I don't really have to work as hard, to prove myself. And so when I left Winnipeg and I got to Vancouver the first time, Michelle Starr came to me and goes, well, listen, you've been wrestling 8 years. Like, where do you see yourself on the card? Like what angle would you like to be in? And, who do you want to be programmed with? And I just remember being so burned out just from, being immersed in, the booking politics of Winnipeg and that whole deal, that I said, what, if it's all the same with you, Mr. Starr, I'd just like to work the opener. And he looked at me like I had 2 heads. And he said, are you serious? Like, you're a guy with some time. I said, no, I would just like to work the opener and not have that pressure of, guys feeling that I've come in from the outside and I'm campaigning for a spot, or, and I don't care, like, if I'm going over or I'm putting somebody over, like, just give me a year of just being the opener and just, refinding my spot. And, every now and then you would have a match where, and Adam Pearce was one of those guys where, you have this self-image of yourself, from the time you've had in the business, where you feel like you're really good. And then when you get in the ring with a guy who is truly a master, within 3 minutes of engagement, you have that aha moment to realize, like, holy shit, I'm not actually that good. We're like, what, I'm just average, and I shouldn't be in main events. But to his credit, he was a world champion, and in that old school style of wrestling, made me look credible as a main eventer. And I just remember, coming out of that match, and just sort of having that light bulb moment of saying, like, wow. And there's only been, you know, out of, you know, close to 1,600 matches that I've had, you know, 2 or 3 times where I've had a situation like that, where you're in there with somebody that you realize I am completely outclassed in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, when you have that awareness to realize that, you know, your shit doesn't stink, you know, your shit does stink. You know, that those were probably very valuable to me. Or when you'd have an opportunity to work with someone that you respected tremendously. I can remember a match in the Cloverdale Fairgrounds where I was working with Gangrel. And, you know, at that time I was kind of known as I'm not a punch, stomp, and kick guy. I'm a wrestling guy, and I'm not going to brawl with you. I'm going to wrestle you. And I remember, you know, we were talking about the match, and I said, why don't we turn that around? Because you're kind of known as a punch, stomp, and kick guy. And so why don't we turn it around where, you know, you're the baby face, you want to wrestle, and I just want to punch, stomp, and kick. And, you know, he's like, yeah, that sounds fun. Let's do it. And I remember him coming back after the match, and he was talking to the referee, and the referee said, how was that for you? And he said, you know, I really like working with Vance, Nevada, because every time I do, I learn something new.
That's a hell of a compliment.
And I just thought like, that's such a flattering statement. Like, here is this guy who has had, you know, the career heights that he has had. He doesn't have to say anything. and just this tremendous compliment. And you know, in front of the locker room where guys are like, well, holy shit, that name guy just said that this local guy who, you know, we see every week is really good.
Yeah.
You know, so it is kind of moments like that, you know, sometimes not even entire matches, just moments within matches that, you know, were takeaways, both good and bad. You know, sometimes when you have a match and in your mind, you think, oh, this is going to be great. And then you go out there and yeah, it takes a fatal wrong turn.
Amazing. The book is called Uncontrolled Chaos. How can people order it?
Well, I'm hopeful that by the time we hit air, it will be live on friesenpress.com.
Friesenpress.com.
Yeah, nice Manitoba company.
Yeah.
Based in Altona. Yeah, so people will have the option to purchase hardcover, paperback, or electronic edition. Yeah, it'll be available worldwide probably by the time this interview hits air.
Awesome. And will you be doing book signings? Will you be touring with the book at all?
Yeah, we'll be having. We've already started to, you know, make some commitments in principle. You know, in Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec, Alberta, Saskatchewan. No dates in BC or the Maritimes yet. But as soon as I've got you know, carry copy of inventory in hand, then I'll be making those announcements loudly and widely. And
when you travel, will you be traveling with hardcover or soft, or will it matter?
I probably with paperback.
Yeah.
Especially if you're traveling by plane and they're really concerned about weight.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, and depending on how the schedule comes together, maybe it's a drive, and that's not foreign to me. So stay tuned on those details as they take shape.
Well, that's excellent. We wish you the best of luck with the book. We encourage everyone who listens to the podcast to buy it. I'll be buying a copy. Hopefully, maybe we'll even get you on the show when you're in Manitoba for the book signing.
Sure. Sounds great, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vance.